Most people spend their entire lives trying to fix the wrong things. They work harder. They chase promotions. They read books about productivity, discipline, and success. And yet, something never quite lines up. The foundation doesn't hold. The decisions don't compound. The effort doesn't translate into what they were actually hoping to build. Here is what almost no one tells you. 3,000 years ago, a collection of writings already diagnosed this problem with precision. Not in vague spiritual terms, not in empty encouragement, but in specific structural principles, a layered architecture for human life that addresses why some people build things that last and why others spend decades rebuilding the same things over and over again. That collection is the book of Proverbs. And before you assume you already know what it contains, I want to offer you a fair warning. What we're going to examine today is not what most people have been taught. Proverbs is not a list of inspirational quotes. It is an operating manual, written by one of the most strategically intelligent minds in the ancient world, refined over generations and validated across thousands of years of human experience. There are 12 principles inside this text, 12 specific interconnected principles that, when understood in sequence, describe not just a philosophy, but a complete system for building a stable and prosperous life. We are going to walk through all 12 of them today, and by the end you will understand why these principles appear in the order they do, and why that order is not accidental. Before we continue, if you're not yet subscribed to this channel, take a moment to do that now, and write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this message is reaching. Here is the central question this video is built around. Why do intelligent, hard-working people still end up with unstable lives? This is not a rhetorical question. It is one of the most practically important questions a person can ask. Because if hard work were sufficient, then effort alone would produce results. But we all know people who worked hard their entire lives and still arrived at the end with very little to show for it. And we know others who seem to operate with a kind of quiet consistency, who don't appear to hustle more than everyone else, but whose lives compound, whose decisions hold, whose families carry something forward. The difference is rarely intelligence. It is rarely even effort. The difference, as Proverbs frames it, is the sequence in which a person builds. The ancient world understood something that modern culture has largely forgotten, that there is an order to things. That certain foundations must be laid before certain structures can stand. That wisdom is not simply a collection of good ideas. It is a discipline of sequencing, of knowing what comes first, what comes second, and what cannot be placed before its time. Proverbs organizes 12 of these foundational principles, and the reason most people who have read Proverbs still don't live by these principles is that they have encountered them as isolated verses, not as a connected architecture. That changes today. Solomon, the son of David and king of Israel, is credited with composing the majority of Proverbs, though the text itself acknowledges contributions from others, including Agur and King Lemuel, whose mother's words appear in the final chapter. What made Solomon's wisdom unusual was not that it was mystical, it was that it was extraordinarily practical. The ancient historical records, including those in 1 Kings, describe a king who was sought by rulers from across the known world, not for military power, but for counsel. The Queen of Sheba traveled a great distance specifically to test his wisdom through questions, and the text records that she found the reality exceeded even what she had heard. The Talmudic tradition, the body of Jewish rabbinic commentary developed over centuries, treats Proverbs not as poetry, but as instruction. The Hebrew word used throughout the book is mashal, which translates roughly as a governing principle or a parable with practical application. These were not meant to be admired. They were meant to be applied, and the structure of the book reflects this. The opening chapter declares its own purpose directly, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young, to help a wise man become wiser, to help a person of understanding acquire guidance. What follows is not random. What follows is a sequence. The first principle is foundational in the most literal sense. Proverbs 1:7 states it plainly, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." This principle is frequently misunderstood, and that misunderstanding causes people to skip past it entirely. The Hebrew word used here is yirah, and while it can mean fear in the sense of terror, in this context it refers to something closer to awe, reverence, and a recognition of one's proper place in relation to something greater than oneself. It is the disposition of a person who understands that they are not the final authority on reality. Why does this matter practically? Because a person who operates as if they are the final authority on everything, who makes decisions based solely on their own preferences, their own analysis, their own comfort, is a person who cannot receive correction. And a person who cannot receive correction cannot build anything durable. Every system that has ever collapsed, whether a business, a household, a government, or a relationship, has collapsed because someone refused to acknowledge the limits of their own judgment at a critical moment. This principle is not about religion in a narrow sense. It is about humility as a structural necessity. Without it, the other 11 principles cannot function properly. And that creates a natural question. If humility is the foundation, what is the next layer? The second principle is the active pursuit of wisdom, not as an abstract ideal, but as a deliberate practice. Proverbs 4:7 is direct. Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and in all your getting, get understanding. What is striking about this passage is the verb get. It is active, intentional. It implies effort, exchange, and priority. The ancient rabbinical tradition understood this to mean that wisdom must be sought above material acquisition, because wisdom is the instrument that makes everything else sustainable. The practical application is straightforward. A person who prioritizes the accumulation of knowledge, judgment, and discernment before the accumulation of things will make better decisions with whatever they eventually accumulate. A person who reverses that order frequently finds that what they accumulated requires more wisdom to maintain than they have available. The modern version of this error is familiar. Someone receives an inheritance, a windfall, or a period of high income before they have developed the judgment to steward it. The money disappears, not through theft or misfortune, through the absence of the second principle. But this principle, pursued honestly, generates a further complication, because once you begin genuinely seeking wisdom, you encounter a third necessity. The third principle is diligence, and Proverbs addresses it more frequently than almost any other topic. Proverbs 10:4, lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Proverbs 12:24, diligent hands will rule, but laziness ends in forced labor. The pattern is consistent throughout the text. Consistent, disciplined effort applied over time is not optional. It is the mechanism by which wisdom becomes tangible. A person may have humility, may even have developed genuine understanding, but without disciplined execution, neither translates into anything real. What is historically interesting here is how the ancient Jewish commercial tradition interpreted this. The Talmudic concept of melasha, meaningful, productive work, was elevated to a form of dignity. Work was not a punishment. It was a participation in creation. The artisan, the merchant, the farmer, all were seen as fulfilling a serious obligation through their craft. Joseph, in the Genesis account, demonstrates this principle in its most extreme form. Sold into slavery in Egypt, he did not treat his circumstances as an excuse. He worked with such diligence and reliability that he was eventually placed in charge of the entire household of Potiphar, and later in charge of all of Egypt. The principle preceded every other advantage he received. Diligence, however, without the fourth principle frequently destroys itself. The fourth principle is one of the most underestimated in the entire book. Proverbs 18:21. The tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. This is not a metaphor about being polite. It is a structural observation about how words function in the world of relationships, reputation, and decision-making. Consider the practical implications. Every significant relationship in a person's life, professional, personal, familial, is shaped almost entirely by what is said and how it is said. Trust is built through words. Trust is destroyed through words. Opportunities are created through communication. They are closed through careless, dishonest, or reckless speech. Proverbs 13:3 frames it with sharp clarity. Those who guard their lips preserve their lives, but those who speak rashly will come to ruin. The historical record offers a striking illustration. The rabbinical tradition contains extensive commentary on lashon hara, literally the evil tongue, referring to destructive or damaging speech. This concern was treated with remarkable seriousness, not because words were considered mystical, but because the rabbis had observed empirically that reputational damage, family conflict, and community fractures almost always originated in speech. The consequences were practical, not merely moral. A person who masters this principle protects everything they build through the previous three, and yet even that is not sufficient, because what is earned and protected still requires something more. Here is where many people believe the financial teaching in Proverbs begins. It does not. It begins at the first principle, but it becomes explicitly financial here. Proverbs 21:20. The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. The image is precise. Two people receive the same resource. One stores a portion, one consumes everything immediately. Over time, the gap between them becomes irreversible, not because of intelligence or talent, but because of a single habit applied consistently. Proverbs 13:11 reinforces this from the opposite direction. Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. The ancient Jewish merchant class developed an application of this principle that became one of the most recognizable features of their commercial culture. Systematic allocation. A portion of every gain was set aside, not spent, not invested yet, but protected, reserved. This practice predates modern financial planning by thousands of years, and it functioned on a simple insight. The person who controls the allocation of their resources controls the trajectory of their life. The error that most people make at this stage is instructive. They understand the principle, they agree with it intellectually, and they still consume everything, because stewardship requires something they haven't yet developed. It requires the next principle to be in place first. Proverbs 22:7 contains one of the most direct financial statements in all of ancient literature. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. This is not a condemnation of all debt. It is a precise description of the relationship between a borrower and a lender, and a warning about what that relationship costs beyond the monetary interest rate. Debt obligates future labor to present consumption. It reduces the borrower's options, flexibility, and negotiating power. In the ancient world, debt bondage was a literal and well-understood institution. A person who could not repay might forfeit years of their labor, or the labor of their children. Proverbs reflects a culture that understood this outcome to be not just unfortunate, but structurally predictable. The modern application is not that debt is always wrong. It is that unnecessary debt taken on to accelerate consumption rather than to enable productive capacity, consistently functions as the mechanism that destroys everything the previous 5 principles were building. Most people encounter financial difficulty not because they lack income. They encounter it because their obligations exceeded their reserves. And they had no reserve because stewardship was never established. And stewardship was never established because the tongue was never controlled. And the tongue was never controlled because wisdom was never prioritized. And wisdom was never prioritized because humility was never installed as the foundation. The principles are not isolated. They are sequential. They are cumulative. And now arrives the most overlooked of all 12, Proverbs 21:5. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. This principle is where most people stop before they ever begin. Not because they don't believe it, but because planning requires something painful. It requires acknowledging uncertainty before acting. It requires sitting with incomplete information and still producing a structure. Proverbs 20:18 extends this. Plans are established by seeking advice, so if you wage war, obtain guidance. The inclusion of warfare here is not accidental. Solomon understood that the higher the stakes of a decision, the greater the cost of entering it without a plan. Yet the human tendency under high stakes is precisely the opposite: to act faster, to commit before thinking, to mistake movement for progress. Nehemiah is one of the most instructive figures in the biblical historical record on this principle. When he received word that the walls of Jerusalem lay in ruins, his first response was not immediate action. He mourned, he prayed, he observed. He spent 4 months, before he made a single move. And when he finally approached King Artaxerxes with his request, he had a complete plan. The materials needed, the timeline required, the letters of permission that would be necessary for each leg of the journey. The king granted everything he asked, not because Nehemiah was lucky, because Nehemiah had planned precisely enough that his request left no room for doubt. The gap between intention and outcome in most people's lives is not a failure of desire. It is a failure of this principle. Few who reach the 8th principle have understood all 7 before it, and that is why this one so frequently fails. Proverbs 15:22. Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisers they succeed. Proverbs 11:14. For lack of guidance a nation falls, but victory is won through many advisers. The principle is not simply about asking for opinions. It is about building a consistent practice of placing your thinking in front of people who can see what you cannot. Every person has blind spots, structural gaps in their perception that they cannot close through more thinking, because the thinking itself is what creates the gap. An advisor who has operated in the domain you are entering carries not just information, but pattern recognition, the kind that only comes from having made the mistakes you are about to make. The ancient Jewish tradition formalized this through the institution of the Beit Din, a council of judgment, and through the cultural emphasis on the Rav, the teacher or mentor, as a lifelong relationship rather than a temporary resource. Seeking counsel was not a sign of weakness. It was understood as a sign of seriousness. The error of this era is the belief that information is a substitute for counsel. It is not. Knowing facts about a subject and having a relationship with someone who has navigated that subject in practice are entirely different resources. One answers questions. The other anticipates the questions you haven't thought to ask yet. This is the principle that surprises people, and it is the one most frequently interpreted incorrectly. Proverbs 11:24-25. One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. This is not a promise of spiritual reward detached from practical mechanism. The ancient world understood generosity as a social technology, a system for building the kind of reputation, trust, and relational capital that opens doors which pure financial capital cannot. A generous person expands their network. A generous person creates loyalty. A generous person becomes someone that others want to succeed, and they actively create the conditions for that success. The accumulation of resources without generosity produces something the ancient texts consistently warned against: hoarding. And hoarding produces isolation. A person who has wealth but no relationships built through generosity finds that the wealth creates enemies instead of allies. Proverbs does not treat generosity as charity. It treats it as an investment in the social fabric that makes prosperity sustainable over time. Proverbs 10:9. Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out. Proverbs 28:6. Better the poor, whose walk is blameless, than the rich whose ways are perverse. The emphasis on integrity throughout Proverbs is not moral decoration. It is structural architecture. A person of integrity, whose word can be relied upon, whose dealings are transparent, whose reputation matches their reality, possesses an asset that cannot be manufactured, cannot be purchased, and cannot be recovered quickly once lost. The ancient merchants of the Mediterranean world, many of them Jewish traders who operated across vast distances, conducted transactions before the era of legal contracts and enforcement mechanisms. What bound them was reputation. A merchant whose word was reliable could access credit, partnerships, and markets that were simply unavailable to those whose word was not. Integrity created access, and access compounded. Proverbs 24:16. For though the righteous fall 7 times, they rise again, but the wicked stumble when calamity strikes. The number 7 in the ancient Hebrew tradition signified completion, fullness. This verse is not saying that a righteous person falls a specific number of times. It is saying that no matter how complete the falling appears to be, the person who is built on the preceding principles will rise, because they have something to return to. Perseverance is not simply stubbornness. It is the capacity to experience failure without losing the foundation. A person who is built on the first 10 principles experiences setbacks differently than someone who has not, because they have humility to reorient, wisdom to learn from the failure, discipline to re-engage, and a network of counsel to help them identify what went wrong. The person who has none of those foundations experiences the same setback as a catastrophe with no recovery mechanism. Proverbs 13:22. A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, but a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. The 12th principle brings the entire architecture into focus. Proverbs is not simply a system for individual prosperity. It is a multi-generational framework. The inheritance referenced here is not limited to financial assets. It includes reputation, wisdom, habits, disciplines, relationships, and the demonstrated example of a life built on principle. A person who has lived the first 11 principles and then transmits those principles, consciously, intentionally, through teaching and modeling, creates something that extends beyond their own lifespan. The wealthiest families in history, not merely in financial terms but in terms of influence, stability, and longevity, have consistently operated this way. The accumulation was never the point. The transmission was the point. The accumulation was simply the evidence that the principles were working. Solomon built not only a kingdom, but an economic infrastructure that made Israel one of the wealthiest nations in the known world during his reign. The historical records describe trade routes, commercial agreements, and international partnerships that generated what the text describes as more silver and gold than could be counted. But what is often overlooked is the mechanism. Solomon built relationships first. He established agreements with Hiram of Tyre based on trust and mutual benefit. He created economic conditions that attracted talent and commerce from surrounding nations. The wealth was the result of the principles, not the principles of the wealth. The Phoenician and Jewish merchant traditions that emerged from this era carried these principles into the ancient commercial world. For centuries, traders operating across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East functioned without the legal enforcement infrastructure that modern commerce takes for granted. What held their networks together was precisely the architecture Proverbs describes: integrity, counsel, diligence, stewardship, and reputation. The principles worked, not as theory, as practice, documented, repeated, and transmitted across generations. What can you do with this today? Begin with an honest assessment of where the sequence breaks down for you, not in the abstract, specifically. If your financial life is unstable, trace it back. Is stewardship absent? Is debt accumulating? Go one level further. Is planning absent? Go further still. Is counsel being refused? Keep going until you find the layer that hasn't been properly built. That is where the work begins. Not at the symptom, at the missing foundation. If integrity is where you identify the gap, the first step is not grand, but it is small and immediate. Honor one commitment you made and haven't kept. Correct one discrepancy between what you say and what you do. Let your actions become reliable in one specific context before expanding. If stewardship is the gap, begin with allocation. Before you spend anything this week, set aside a portion, however modest, and do not touch it. The amount is secondary. The habit is primary. If generosity has been absent, find one practical way this week to give something of value, time, knowledge, resources, attention, to someone without an immediate expectation of return. Observe what it produces in you before you evaluate what it produces around you. The principles compound, but they only compound when they are practiced, not when they are understood. If this has been useful to you, share this video with someone in your life who would benefit from hearing it. This is the kind of message that lands differently depending on where a person is in their journey. And you may know exactly who needs to hear it today. We began with a simple observation. Most people spend their lives trying to fix the wrong things, trying to build the 7th floor before the 1st floor is in place, trying to accumulate before they've learned to steward, trying to plan before they've developed the humility to acknowledge that their last plan failed. Proverbs is not a self-help text dressed in ancient language. It is a map of human behavior, drawn with extraordinary precision by a mind that had the resources to test every principle at scale, and the intellectual honesty to record what actually worked. 12 principles, 12 layers, each one preparing the ground for the next: the fear of the Lord, the pursuit of wisdom, diligence in work, control of the tongue, stewardship of resources, avoidance of unnecessary debt, planning before acting, seeking counsel, generosity, integrity, perseverance, and the building of a legacy. None of them are shortcuts, all of them are available. The question Proverbs leaves with every reader is not whether these principles are true. 3,000 years of human experience have already answered that question. The question is simpler than that. At which layer will you begin? The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. Proverbs 4:7.